History is filled with famous names, but sometimes it's the people you've never heard of who change everything. There was a man, an organizational genius, who built the entire machine of the Bolshevik state, the very machine that Joseph Stalin would one day use to rule. So think about this. What if Stalin's terrifying rise to absolute power wasn't some grand inevitable destiny? What if it only happened because of a complete freak accident of history, the sudden death of the man who held his future job first? Well, that man's name was Yakov Sverdlov. You see, back in 1918, Yakov Sverdlov became the first ever chairman of the Secretariat of the Communist Party. This was, for all intents and purposes, the most powerful organizational job in the entire Soviet state. And who was the very next person to hold that title? Yep, Joseph Stalin. So who on earth was this guy who stood in Stalin's path? To really get a handle on Sverdlov, you have to understand where he came from. He wasn't some intellectual writing theories in a cafe. No, he was what the Bolsheviks called a professional revolutionary, a man hardened and shaped by years of dangerous underground work, prison cells, and brutal exile. I mean, look at this. Sverdlov joins the party when he's just a teenager. And from 1906 all the way to 1917, he's almost constantly either locked up or banished. But this cycle of punishment didn't break him. It forged him into an incredibly disciplined and tough organizer. And a really key part of that experience was his time in Siberia, exiled right alongside another revolutionary you might have heard of, Joseph Stalin. And these two weren't exactly best buddies. Sverdlov's own words tell you everything you need to know. He basically said they couldn't stand the sight of each other. It was so bad they just didn't even talk. This personal dislike makes it even crazier that one would end up directly succeeding the other. So when the revolution finally kicks off in 1917, Sverdlov gets back to Petrograd, and this is where he really comes into his own. He was the ultimate backroom operator, the guy who could turn all those fiery revolutionary speeches into a real, functioning, centralized government. So how'd he do it? What was his secret weapon? It was something called the Kartoteka. You can basically think of it as a pre-computer database, or like a revolutionary's version of LinkedIn. Sverdlov had this incredible memory, and he kept a massive card file on thousands of party members. He knew their skills, their weaknesses, who was loyal, and who could be sent to handle a tough job. He knew the party's human resources better than anyone. And this wasn't just some abstract skill. I mean, listen to this amazing anecdote from Leon Trotsky. He said that Lenin would call Sverdlov with a problem, only to be told, already, meaning it's done. Sverdlov had already anticipated the need and taken care of it. He was always one step ahead. He wasn't just following orders, he was running the whole show from behind the scenes. He put that Kartoteka to work. He'd dispatch commissars he trusted to the far corners of the country to make sure Moscow's orders were followed. He set up these revkomi, or revolutionary committees, to act as the Bolsheviks' local government. And when the Civil War broke out, he organized a massive draft of party members, sending half of them to the front lines. He turned the entire party into a weapon. Now, this is absolutely crucial. Sverdlov was unique. He was the chairman of the party secretariat, which means he controlled the party. And he was also the chairman of the All-Russian Central Executive Committee, making him the formal head of state. He controlled both the party and the state at the same time. He was the central node that everything passed through. Nobody else, before or after, had that exact concentration of power. But building a machine that efficient, that powerful, well, it had a very dark side. Sverdlov's genius for organization was also used to carry out some of the Bolsheviks' most ruthless and brutal policies during the Russian Civil War. After an assassination attempt on Lenin in 1918, it was Sverdlov who personally drafted the public call for merciless mass terror. He wasn't just a bystander. He was a key architect of the Red Terror, the campaign of mass arrests and executions that followed. And this brings us to one of the most infamous moments of the entire revolution, the execution of Tsar Nicholas II and his whole family. The debate has raged for a century over who gave the final order, but Sverdlov's name is right at the center of all the evidence. So let's look at what we know. The telegraph messages sent to the local Bolsheviks, instructing them to carry out the execution, were signed by Sverdlov. Leon Trotsky later wrote in his diary that Sverdlov himself confirmed the decision came from the top, from Moscow. And Sverdlov gave him the chilling justification. Lenin felt they couldn't risk leaving the enemy white forces a live banner to rally their troops. So for about 16 months, Sverdlov is the indispensable man, the engine of the entire Bolshevik state, second only to Lenin himself in real practical power. He's at the absolute height of his influence, and then, out of nowhere, it all just stops. He was just 33 years old. That's it, 33. The same age as Alexander the Great when he died. At the absolute peak of his power, his story comes to a sudden, shocking end. In March of 1919, he was traveling for the party, and he caught the Spanish flu that was ravaging the entire world. Within days, he was dead. It wasn't a bullet, it wasn't a political rival, it was a virus, a random biological event. And just like that, it ripped a gigantic organizational hole right through the heart of the Soviet government.
Of course, a power vacuum that big doesn't stay empty for long, and the man who would eventually step up to fill it was none other than his old, estranged roommate from that miserable exile in Siberia. 3 years later, in 1922, Joseph Stalin gets the newly created job of General Secretary. And here's the kicker. He didn't have to build the machine of control from scratch. He inherited it. He was handed the keys to the entire apparatus, the control systems, the personnel files, the centralized command structure that Yakov Sverdlov had painstakingly built and perfected. Even Lenin knew exactly what they had lost. In his eulogy for Sverdlov, he called him the most perfectly complete type of professional revolutionary. I mean, coming from Lenin, that's about the highest praise imaginable. It just shows you how utterly critical Sverdlov was to their whole project. Which leaves us with this final, absolutely mind-bending question. If that tiny virus hadn't found Yakov Sverdlov in 1919, what would have happened? He was the master of the party machine he himself had built. He had Lenin's total trust. Would he have been the one to go head-to-head with Stalin for control after Lenin died? We could never know for sure, but it is one of history's most fascinating and chilling what-ifs.